Well, here you are again. Nature. Today we're going to look at the big question, good and evil. Now in nature, there's no good, there's no evil, there's just consequences. If you're an insect, most likely you'll be eaten by a bird. And the bird will be eaten by something else. There's no such thing as a good animal or a bad animal. It does what it needs to do in order to survive. Now, human beings, somehow we think we're different to the animals around us, and we are. Not because we evolved in another way, but because we now have the capacity to create myths and stories about ourselves and the people around us. And this is where the concept of good and evil comes from. We're told that bad things happen because there are evil forces on the planet, and irrespective of what religious belief you believe in, they're all based on this titanic struggle between good and evil. So, is there any factual evidence that there are external forces which promote good or evil? The facts are there aren't. We're part of nature. In nature there are consequences. And what we have done as human beings, irrespective of culture, language, spoken, religious beliefs, is that we have created these myths in order to justify what's happening around us, what's happening in our communities, what's happening in our society, what's happening around the world. We're told there are good guys and bad guys. There is good and evil. The reality is, the single common theme in all human struggle has been the theme between centralisation of power and wealth, not between good and evil. What we as human beings have allowed to occur, and in a few cases struggled against, is the centralisation of that power and wealth, believing that centralisation of power and wealth in a minuscule minority will somehow give us security. The fact is that some of the most exploitive practices that have occurred in human history have not occurred as a result of human aggression or aggression from neighbours, but have occurred as a result of the centralisation of power and wealth. The greater the centralisation of power, the greater damage that can be caused by an individual or a small group of people. And every day we see examples of this, not just today, but yesterday, and since time immemorial. So that struggle between good and evil is a struggle between centralisation of power and wealth and the decentralisation of power and the redistribution of wealth. The dilemma is that in the 21st century, with all the technological innovations we have created, we now have the situation where a few individuals waving the flag of nationalism can and could destroy the planet many times over. Destroy all human history. Destroy the past as well as the present. And deny any offspring a future. And the more centralisation of power and wealth we see, the greater the damage that can be inflicted. And we see this every day. We look at the centralisation of power. Today, in the 21st century, power is centralised in a small number of sovereign nation states as well as a small number of transnational corporations. Sovereign independence is an illusion. That sovereign independence is dependent on having somebody with a big stick looking after you, whether it's Russia or China or the United States of America. That's the reality. And in these countries, whether it's Russia or China or the USA, what we've seen is the centralisation of power in the hands of a small clique, which could and may and will at some stage create enormous damage around the world. Now, whether they're self-appointed dictators, or whether they're part of a one-party state, or whether they're part of a pseudo-democracy, or whether they're part of a parliamentary or representative democracy, the end game is the same. Because it's quite interesting that the only nation state that has used nuclear bombs against civilians is the United States of America, which is a parliamentary democracy. At the same time, we're seeing the Chinese oligarchy and the Russian oligarchy try to extend their influence. So it's not the problem isn't the fact they're Russian or Chinese or Americans. The problem is we have allowed the creation of political systems which put our faith in a small number of people. Whether it's the head of a religious authority, whether it's the head of a secular nation state, or both, we somehow think that if we centralise power, we will obtain security. The dilemma isn't the other. The dilemma is, when you look at human history, is the centralisation of power in an individual or an oligarchy. The destruction caused by World War II and the Holocaust, which was engineered by the German Nazi Party, could only have occurred if there was a centralisation of power. It could only occur if people were forced through a variety of mechanisms to obey orders from a centralised authority, and if they didn't obey those orders, there were extreme consequences for them. We see it today in Israel. We see it today in the Ukraine. We see it today everywhere. That's just the centralisation of power in the hands of minority. Then at a more dangerous level, we have the centralisation of wealth. And what we have seen over the past 5 decades through deregulation, and deregulation is a simple concept. It's about removing regulations which have been put in place to protect individuals or the environment, to allow business to go ahead with its major function to create profits, ever-increasing profits for its major shareholders. We've seen privatisation. We've seen all the struggles of the 19th century, which resulted in a parliamentary democracy in the Western world, washed away in a tsunami of privatisation, The history of the 18th and 19th century was the fact that the private sector, which is based on a private investment for private profit mentality, cannot deliver basic services to everyone, and that's the key. Democracy isn't rule of the people by the people. Democracy is the greatest good for the greatest number. So by virtually giving away public assets which have been built up over generations, which provided essential services to the population, to the private sector, we now see an inversion in what happens to profits. 50 years ago, if you're an investor and invested $1 and you made a profit, 1/3 of that profit would return to the investor and 2/3 would return to the workers who made that profit. In 2024, as a result of privatisation and globalisation and corporatisation and deregulation, the equation has been turned on its head. 2/3 of that profit returns to the investor and 1/3 to the worker who made that profit. No wonder we now have a surplus of billionaires on the planet. But the dilemma is that when you centralise wealth, it has a profound impact on millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. We now have 8 billion people on planet Earth, and within 30 years there'll be 10 billion. We have limited resources, finite resources. We live in a society on a planet where we are slowly poisoning ourselves because we do not want to put any brakes in the way of the private investment for private profit mantra that rules our lives. So when we talk about good and evil, these are constructs, nothing more, nothing less. Good and evil does not exist as some type of arbitrary concept outside the human construct. And we have created that good and evil. And we have created that good and evil because we've left it to other people to provide us with security, to provide us with the basic necessities. We have created that good and evil because we have allowed ourselves to be divided on the basis of colour or race or gender or sexual orientation or 101 differences, which ultimately are nothing more than a variation in the human species. Let's not forget that in the past there are over 50 different types of humans as nature experimented. And we were the dominant, the Cro-Magnons were the dominant because we were able to remove through violence the rest of the competition on planet Earth. But today we face extraordinary threats. We face the threat of the climate emergency, which some people continue to deny, although every fact confirms that we are in the process of a climate emergency. We face the existential threat of nuclear annihilation as nation states battle for supremacy, battle for economic power, battle for military supremacy. And like in the past, where millions died for the good of God, King, Queen and country, while receiving nothing in return, we have the same mentality which is beginning to overtake us. And many people ignore this reality, somehow thinking, creating some false identity, some false world which is based on myth and beliefs, that somehow this will protect us in the long run. Ultimately, We are part and parcel of nature. And in nature there are consequences. If you're a rabbit and you ignore a fox, if that fox is hungry, it will kill you. It's the same with the human species. If we ignore the climate emergency, if we ignore the increasing militarisation, if we ignore the increasing centralisation of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands, we will suffer those consequences. The fact is that we are no different to an insect, to an animal. What is different is that we have the capacity to change. We have the intellectual capacity, the social networks, and the scientific innovations to tackle all these problems. We have the capacity to create new societies which are not based on hierarchy, new societies which don't centralise power and wealth in a minuscule number of hands. New societies where our security comes from an understanding that our common humanity is the most important weapon we have in that struggle to ensure our species continues to survive on this planet. And those minuscule numbers who think that somehow we're going to fly away from Mother Earth onto another planet and destroy that planet, just remember, it's the rich and the infamous who actually control the technology to fly you to another planet, so you'll be left, like me, on planet Earth. So, if you're looking for a new way of living, if you're sick and tired of relying on rulers, both secular and religious, to show you how to survive, if you believe that we are the people we've been waiting for, I encourage you to look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interests website, and I encourage you to join today. It's very simple. Join today, understand the present, change the future for good.